Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on NFTS Backstories in association with the BFI. Today, we're going to be joined by composer Stuart Earl. Stuart has many composing credits under his belt, from Black Mirror to And Then There Were None to more recently the music for the Netflix film Persuasion. We're going to talk to Stuart today about his role as a composer, how he got started, what the composer does when they come into the film or the television project, and give you a bit more information if you're thinking about a career in composing. Hello, Stuart. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start with hello. I'm going to start with a kind of an early question, if you don't mind. When did you get interested in music, and when did you decide that the role of composer was a role that existed and that you were interested in it?
Okay. Big question, big stuff. So how did I get interested in music? So when I was at school, I was playing clarinet and things like that. But I didn't come from a big musical background, or my parents don't play instruments, or I didn't grow up with classical music in the house or anything like that. But my dad would listen to his record collections, which were kind of Motown and things like that. So music was around, but it wasn't we were not a musical family, as it were. But then just at school, I think it was in the 80s, and there was an ident for LWT, London Weekend Television, and there was a guy who swung a saxophone around, and I thought that looked really cool. So I said, "Can I learn the saxophone?" And they said, "No, you're too small." So I started playing the clarinet. And I sort of just carried on playing. And then I started getting into bands and playing drums and guitars in bands. So it's kind of a bit of a winding road. And then I got really, because I was in bands, I got really interested in recording for bands. Because, once you're in a band, you want to record the greatest album of all time, of course, which we didn't, but we did record some albums. And then so I was getting more and more interested in that. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll go to university to do sound engineering. But at the same time, I'd been secretly been doing all this kind of classical music in the background, as part of GCSE and A-level. And then one of the teachers just suggested, why don't you try doing music A-level? And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And I did at A-level, and then I ended up going to university. Sort of ridiculously, bearing in mind I knew nothing. I ended up going to Oxford to study music, and I felt so on the back foot because I was learning so much, because I was coming from zero, really. And whilst I was there, God, this is such a long preamble. But so I'd just been, everything was so new to me, because and someone played me, one of my teachers when I was doing A-level, played me a piece of music by Stravinsky called The Rite of Spring, and it kind of changed everything in my brain a little bit, as in I just thought, well, this is sort of classical music, something that I really want to get to know a little bit more about and pursue. And all of this whilst doing sort of band stuff and playing in like rock bands and doing pop stuff as well, so kind of a real mix. And then when I was at university, I started kind of realizing that I wasn't the greatest clarinet orchestral player, and I was never going to kind of go further with that. And I was getting more interested in the idea of sort of creating and writing and doing that. And so I started doing some music for some art installations and a play, and just the idea of creating and writing seemed kind of more exciting to me at that point, even though I didn't have any idea what I was doing. And then one of my friends, when I was at university, her dad was George Fenton, who's obviously an absolute legend. And I'd never even really thought about doing film music or anything like that. And I met him a few times, and I thought, oh, well, that's quite a cool job. Not quite realizing how on top of his game he was, and like the heights he had scaled to get to where he was. And he was a lovely guy, and is a lovely guy, and I occasionally bump into him. And so that was what sort of kind of, I thought, oh, that's a job, is it? That's something I can do. And because I'd already started doing a little bit of writing, and enjoying the sort of the collaborative nature of it, even though I hadn't really thought that that was what I was going to do. And the more of it that I did, the more I realized it was like almost being in a band where you're a team of people together trying to come up with something really great. And I kind of really enjoyed that collaborative element of, rather than just me writing on my own, doing sort of kind of, you know, I suppose people would call it like concert music or whatever. It was just something quite exciting about that collaborative process. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then also, whilst I was there at university, one of the music students in my year, called Nick Singer, who's a composer, he applied to the film school, the NFTS, straight away. And I was like, oh, that seems like a sensible thing to do if this is maybe what I'm going to maybe think about doing. So, but it wasn't suddenly a life-changing moment. It was a kind of a slow burning kind of just doing a little bit more of chipping away at it and doing more and more, and then working with animators who were friends, who sort of just said, oh, look, do you think you could do a bit of music? And it's like, yeah, cool. So it's kind of, it was a very kind of loose start, and kind of just chipping away and doing a little bit more. And then I applied to the film school after I left and thought, okay, this is definitely, because I came to the open day and thought, wow, this is amazing. And then didn't get in, which was very disappointing. But also at the same time, I was quite pleased because I knew that I wasn't really ready for it at that point. I was kind of, I needed a bit more time to write more music, really. And so went away and went to Bournemouth and did an MA there. And then ended up back at the NFTS studying there.
So you obviously, as you've said, went to the National Film and Television School.
Yeah.
You also went to Bournemouth. So there are other courses and other places available. But
yeah.
If you're someone who's listening here and you're young and you're thinking, maybe I don't want to go, is there any other non-educational routes into being a composer? Is there any?
Yeah.
How do you work your way up? Is there
yeah. I mean, I think the only reason why I felt the kind of need to do a course as well is because it was a lot. It was quite different to the kind of how it is now, I think, in terms of getting hold of material to even write music to was really difficult. I mean, you couldn't go onto the internet and download something or anything like that, obviously. So it was kind of the only way of kind of really doing it was actually doing it. So that was why it kind of seemed appealing to me, and kind of doing the courses just seemed like a kind of a framework for me. But I think now, just writing music is firstly the most important thing to do, because I do remember one person saying to me once, I said, what they said, what do you do? And I said, I want to be a film composer. And they said, are you writing music to films? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you're a film composer then. And I was like, oh, that's quite nice. And I hadn't really thought of it like that. So firstly, just actually make sure you do, if you want to do this, you do have to actually write music to film, and I don't necessarily mean commercial projects, these can be things you're doing yourself, but there's definitely, and I think also because of the internet and people sharing information now, I think it's a lot more open about the idea of assisting and things like that, which when I was starting out was a very secretive hush hush kind of process, and for those of you who may not know what assisting is in terms of in the composing context, it's such a varied job. So you might have someone who you just need to be putting the musical parts down for the players to play for a session. It might be that you need you might be an amazing composer, but you're not that good at doing drum programming, so you might get someone in to do all your drum programming for you, or your synth, you might have a synthesizer expert come in and help you, and or it's a very varied thing, or even up to writing additional music and taking themes that the main composer has written, and then you kind of the assistant can then develop that into their own cues. It's such a wide range and sort of not just in terms of the activities that you're doing as an assistant, but also kind of the hierarchy of it. Because friends of mine who've literally started out doing parts for orchestral sessions, but then have ended up, through doing more and more work, have ended up doing additional music, so writing music for the shows or the films, and then actually ended up becoming co-composers on the show, and then actually in one case of a friend of mine then took over the show from the original composer. So it's that is definitely one way of working your way up. But of course, or even just kind of just thinking of other things as assistants, delivering stems, which is the way you sort of break your music up in how you give it to the mixer at the end, so that they have more options when they're mixing it with the film. Just having someone who can deliver that in Pro Tools and things like that. So it's such a wide range of things that you can do. And I think now, if I was doing it would I would definitely look at assisting now as a way in. I think it's a lot more open, and to the point, even when I'm going for jobs, interviews and meetings, sometimes people were actually quite upfront. Producers will ask me, "Oh, who's your team? How many people in your team?" Whereas when I was starting out, it was sort of, "Oh, it's quite secret, and they've got someone locked in a cupboard somewhere." They don't let anyone know. So it seems quite different now, and I think I think partly because of remote control and Hans Zimmer's kind of system over there. I think it's kind of made it a lot more open and kind of transparent in the kind of way it works. So so it is very different. So you definitely, in answer to your question, you definitely don't have to do lots of courses to do it, but the most important thing is to write. And just kind of, because I think for me that was the thing as well, is you might be writing lovely music or the greatest piece of music in the world, but understanding what that's doing to picture and how it's changing the reading of the scene that you're scoring, all of that is the thing that you can only really do once you start doing it. And also just watch as much stuff as you can and listen to what's going on, because then you suddenly understand what's going on and how the function of the music is working behind everything. So kind of just, in answer to your question, no, you don't need to do the courses, but it's kind of just make sure you write and do a lot of it.
So when you think back to starting off and looking at those films and those TV shows, was there a composer or a film or a series that really first attracted you?
Well, it's kind of that thing of, because of George Fenton's connection, I'd met him a few times. That was a real sort of, not that he sat me down, and because I didn't know him that well, but he didn't sit me down and say, "Watch all of my films, please." But I obviously gave me. I started. Oh, well, what is he doing here? So he'd been doing like the Blue Planet and and things like that, and Planet Earth, and so these were, I mean, this is going back a bit, so that was quite interesting. But things that you kind of quite easily to grab onto, and Danny Elfman's things from Nightmare Before Christmas, and it was a real, because I always feel, and still now, that I'm learning so much about music, because it's like, because I didn't come from a classical background, but sort of ended up doing classical music to a certain extent, through education. So it's kind of, I still feel like I'm constantly listening to stuff. So at the same time as listening to all the film score stuff, which obviously the John Williams things, everyone knows John Williams, even if they think that they don't. It's like, I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. And obviously all the Bond movies. So all of those things were kind of in my psyche, but it was kind of, they sort of felt like they were standard things that I already kind of knew. And it was things like Solaris by Cliff Martinez, uh, um, that was a real kind of wow. That's really different. That's kind of not an orchestra. I don't really know. That feels like it's something coming from somewhere else, and in sort of creating a brand new sound world, and all of those things. So it was it's a bit of a rubbish answer to your question, but there was no one specific person, because it feels like I'm just constantly catching up. So it's kind of, even to now, even now, you're listening to great things all the time. Obviously, the nice thing about film music is you get to watch a film at the same time as listening to stuff. So it's kind of quite a nice thing. I'm trying to think of other composers, but I mean, in terms of that kind of jumping in point, because I had met George, it felt like it almost felt like a personal connection. Of course, it wasn't. It was kind of that was quite a good way of getting into it somehow,
But George is the one where you actually realize, oh, there is this world out there where someone sits and composes music for images, and that's something that I want to connect to.
Yeah, 100%. Because of course, it's very easy just to kind of. I remember seeing an interview or reading an interview with Henry Jackman, the composer, and him telling him describing about what his mum talks about when he gets asked, oh, what does her son do? And he's obviously a massive composer, and she said, oh, he writes the music for the movies. And I remember him saying, oh, often the reply will be, oh, I thought the music just came with the film, as if it's kind of some sort of batteries kind of just comes with it, but realizing that someone's actually sat in a room somewhere writing and rewriting, that I think sort of, that what you were saying there, that because of meeting George and him talking about it, I was like, oh, this is kind of, it feels not just like some other thing that exists just somehow magically. The idea of, and him, I remember him just talking about how he had a VHS player that sort of had a jog wheel, which weren't sort of commercially available to general, and that just seemed really, because they're going to have to keep it's just kind of it kind of made it human, I guess, even though of course it is on top of his game. It's kind of
no, but for you it was that light bulb moment, and that's what's really interesting. So let's zoom ahead a bit. And let's go to you graduating from the NFTS.
Yeah.
So you've come out of the NFTS and you've probably got a show reel of work. And most of it's going to be short film work.
Yeah.
How do you make that first step into the industry? How do you kind of get that first job? And I know it can be quite difficult, and a lot of it is by chance and by connections. But how did that work for you in your case?
Yeah, it's kind of it's the question that I get asked quite a lot from people obviously coming up, and there is no one answer to it, I think. And in terms of everyone has a different way in, and it's kind of, and I think having that assisting thing is which is not what I did, just because I sort of felt so underqualified to be able to sort of do anything for anyone else. So I sort of did it on my own, really. But so there were, I think you speak to a lot of people, and assisting seems to be such a good way to go now. But for me, it was kind of just almost weirdly picking up from the things that I'd been doing before the film school as well. So all the little animations that I'd done for friends who were literally friends, that now had a few years where they were making stuff and they were starting to do commercials, and friends that I knew who were doing short films that I'd scored were now also doing commercials and more short films. And they were like, and also what was quite nice then is that not that many people knew film composers, or seemed to me. So my name got kind of passed around a bit in terms of, oh, we need music. Oh, we can't afford the, light bulb moment where people realize they can't get John Williams for their short film. Basically, does anyone know anyone cheap? And that was sort of me, cheap. And and also at the time I kind of, it was when sample libraries started coming out, which is, and for those who don't know, sample libraries now is such a standard thing, but it's where someone's laboriously gone in and recorded instruments note by note. So when you're literally playing a C on the keyboard, you're playing a C of the oboe or whatever that was recorded in a studio. So the quality of the demos you make now, it can be so good. But I really made sure I was kind of in as budget friendly way as possible. It was just when things were starting to happen where you could afford things that I started making sure that even though I was a cheap composer, I could make things sound good. So it was that was kind of my angle to start with. And I think and the more you do, and you know 8 films out of those 10 short films that I did early on, would disappear. That's fine, but maybe 2 of them, the director would go on and do another one, or the editor would do one, or the sound designer would do one, or the producer would do one, and they would go, oh yeah, there was that guy who managed to do that music quite cheaply and it sounded quite good before. And so that was it's kind of lots of very low budget projects, and kind of doing that kind of thing. But then also, because I've been to the film school, I already had quite a lot of friends making stuff, coming out of the school. And obviously one of the one of the luckiest connections I made early on at the school was with Brian Welsh, who was an editor whilst I was there. But he then very quickly changed to being a director, and he's a great director, and he ended up doing one of the Black Mirrors from the first series when it was on Channel 4, and I'd done a feature film with him before, and I think maybe I'd done another BBC series with him, or I mean, he was moving very quickly after graduating and making really great stuff, and so I managed to kind of jump on with him straight away. So that's kind of one of those things where I would have never planned that connection happening or that contact happening, because Brian, I knew him as an editor to start with, so it's kind of these things never are the kind of masterminded strategic plans you expect. But and the more and it's kind of that thing, the more you do, the more your name sort of gets around. And I remember the BFI were running a short film scheme, and I ended up scoring, I think, over half of the films, just because I'd kind of been around and talking to the producers, and and just kind of building up more, doing more and more little bits and pieces, really, I think. So
it's just about getting your name out there, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of, yeah. And the more you do, the more people hear, and you hopefully the music's all right, and then people like it, and then as much as that, it's kind of just, you just have to be, oh, the guy who did the music for that film, oh yeah, that was quite good.
So let's talk about what happens now in terms of the process. So you mentioned earlier that you obviously go for interviews, and presumably that interview is with the director, but could also include the producer.
Yeah.
What is it a composer needs to bring to that interview? Do you bring kind of demo ideas, or are you just there to try and win it with your previous work and your personality and your thoughts on the project?
So it's so through making several mistakes on this, I've kind of learned. So it's kind of, when you're going for a meeting, it will also depend entirely on at what point you're coming on. But a sort of a usual time for me to be coming on, and slightly ideal, would be just before they're shooting, or sometimes whilst they're shooting, but that's always a bit difficult because the director is thinking of 1,000 million things. But if we just kind of stick, or sometimes we're in post-production when they've already started cutting, and the later you go down, the harder it is as a composer. And maybe I'll talk about that in a bit. But in terms of that initial meeting, most of the time it's before they've shot. And the real key thing that I learned by getting it wrong lots of times was that the one thing that they all know is the script. And you haven't spent a year trying to get this project off the ground, so it's really new to you. So I always make sure I read the script at least twice before I go in. So the first time I just read it. The second time I start making notes, because I immediately realize that I can't remember any of the characters' names or who's related to who or whatever. So I literally make like dummy notes in a notebook. As I said, because I literally have learned this the hard way by getting it wrong. But the reason why I mentioned the script and sort of start off with that, even without talking about music, is because it's the one thing everyone knows, and it's literally the only thing holding everyone together. It's the reason why they're in the room, even because they are making this thing. So what you have to do is take that thing that they all know really, really well. And they might have been on recce's. They've been talking about how they're going to shoot it, how they're going to pace it. You know, you have nothing. So you're trying to work out what's going on. So trying to work out what is the interesting idea and the interesting angle on whatever this is. So if it's even if it's a really standard genre piece, it's like, what is the interesting angle? Because there will be an interesting angle on anything, because it will have had to have got this far. That it will have had to have jumped through so many hoops to get funded, to get greenlit, and to be made for you as a composer to be getting on. There is definitely a reason why all these people are spending money and time getting it to this point. So finding that angle and then talking about the script with them. So not even necessarily about music, but what the story is and how you understand the story, basically, which sounds like a really silly thing to say, but it's really easy to not talk about the thing you're actually making, because actually the people you're working with might know nothing. They might know nothing about music, and that's absolutely fine, because ultimately that's why you're being brought in as a composer. So actually going in, one of my first jobs I did, I remember this is where this is so embarrassing, but I walked into the meeting with a massive piece of score paper and showed the producer, and the producer was just like, that literally means nothing to me. I don't know what you're talking about. And I was just like, oh right, yeah, that's that's interesting, of course. And that was like, okay, that's good, because I thought, oh, that would be really a cool thing for me to do, because that will show how brilliant I am at music. But they sort of are hoping that you are brilliant anyway. And actually what you want to be talking about is their project. So that's ultimately the first thing I'm thinking about. And then also like thematic ideas there, and it's not necessarily musical, like melodic thematic ideas, but literally what is the themes of the show, because then of course that feeds entirely into what you're going to do musically. Because if you're saying, ultimately, even though this is a film set in a period drama, and it's a love story, that's the surface, but ultimately it's about betrayal and kind of heartbreak between siblings. I don't know, I'm making this sounds like an awful film that I'm making up on the spot here, but it's when you start talking about things like betrayal and heartbreak or whatever, or these suddenly become then themes of the story. And then of course, so then the natural progression from that, as you're talking, is to say, this is obviously something that maybe we could talk about, underlining with the score, so that we would have some sort of musical motif, whether it be a melody or even just a sound, or a texture, that is related to betrayal. These are all terms and story things that anyone in a meeting understands, because they might not know what an F sharp minor chord is or whatever, but they know what betrayal is, and how that works with their story that they've spent 2 years getting to this point. So that's kind of that's what you're doing. And then I always have musical references again from things that people will know. And one thing to do is also make sure, again, from mistakes that I've made, don't put composers who are going to be up for the job on your list, because you're essentially then selling them instead of yourself. But yeah, and but coming in with different ideas of music again, because also these are tangible things that people know. So it's kind of, if you're saying, actually, I want this to sound like John Williams doing this, or Hans Zimmer doing that, or whatever, and you have to be careful, because a lot of these things have baggage, because you might think, oh, actually, this is a action film, so we definitely need this score. Actually, they might be thinking, actually, that's thought, they don't want to go anywhere near that, so you can't be lazy with those references, even though they're a good starting point. It's kind of, again, trying to work out ultimately what the angle is that they're trying to take. So I mean, I remember on for a job I did, which was and then there were none, where I didn't know the director at all, and I brought in some quite different references, I thought, because it was a Agatha Christie period drama, and it's a bit, just the script seemed so grungy and kind of just quite really dark for what you were expecting at that point from an Agatha Christie. And so I'd kind of brought in all of these kind of quite dark, grungy, hybrid, orchestral and distorted synth kind of things, because I thought, actually, the obvious thing would have been to say, oh, just kind of, it's quite polite period drama, like acoustic classical stuff. But it just felt very different to me. And obviously I had those in my back pocket as well, just in case they looked at me horrified. But I started talking about these different references, and the director, who I didn't know, just said, oh my God, that's completely crazy. There's a piece of paper in the office, which he went and got. And I think about 5 out of the 6 or 7 references I said, he'd written down. And obviously that's kind of incredibly lucky. And then I ended up getting the job. But what was really interesting there is it's kind of, references, even if it's music that you haven't written yourself, it's a way of pitching it, because it was I'd sort of decided to take a slightly different approach to it, and that had kind of gone down well. But then so there's, I'm talking about this with all this kind of chat, but then also ultimately it's your show reel that they're listening to as well, alongside all of this, which, so can
I ask
yeah.
you, so would you say, therefore, when you come into the interview, you don't need to sell your music because you're already there at that point? You're actually selling your connection to their work.
Yeah, that I would. Yes, exactly. It's really complicated, because I suppose if you've got to that point, they're hoping that you can do it, and that that you can do it. But what they want to do is make sure that you're right for the project. And actually, I think that most composers can pretty much turn their hand to a lot of things, because often they've come from various different backgrounds. It's quite unusual to get a film composer now, I think, who just found their way up through jazz, or their way up through orchestral writing, or maybe as an artist, but even that, let's say. So it's kind of so I think most composers can turn their hand to anything, but ultimately people want to see how you're connecting to the material. So, and also if the stuff you do and clearly are good at is relevant to it. So obviously, if you're doing something that feels like it needs to be quite edgy and synthy and contemporary, I will collate a kind of a show reel, an audio show reel, which is just, which has the most synthy, edgy, modern contemporary stuff I've got, so that they can already see, oh, okay, yeah, that's probably what we're going for, great. And then that's get your foot in the door, and then it's how you connect with the project they're making. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. So basically what you're saying is, part of it is, once you're in that interview, they'll know you. That it's very rare that they'll have come in and completely go, "Who's this guy?" So
but then I have been in a meeting where someone clearly had no idea who I was and was literally looking on my website and listening to my stuff whilst I was in the meeting, which was the most disconcerting thing.
Not particularly professional either.
No, exactly. But it's kind of especially when you're starting out, I didn't really care because it was a job that I really wanted to get. So it's kind of, you sort of have to take it. And also that was the thing, is also I sort of wasn't expecting anyone to know me by name anyway. So it was kind of, I was just excited to be in the room and talking about the job. So it is difficult. And then to take it further, then often, not always, but then after that, then it'll be pitching ideas as well. So like actually going away and then writing certain bits of material that then you'll go up against other composers and they'll use all of that, including your ideas, that will go in competition with everyone else. So but again, there's no set, there's sometimes I've just got a job from a Zoom call, but that's often when people and you've had experience working with them before, or so it's kind of, so sometimes you have to work incredibly hard to get a job, and write a lot of music, come up with a lot of references, do that. So, or sometimes it can be very easy. So it's that seems to be less now, the easy route. But it's kind of it's such a varied way, because I think also people know if they want you or if they want someone else, and sometimes it's a case of just people aligning everyone with maybe what the director wants, or so it's a very, again, it's one of those things where there's no straight single one answer. It's quite a thing.
Okay, so let's move on to the point where, let's presume you've got a job, and let's take, for example, I'm going to use two examples, but you may say they're not quite right. But let's say if we use And Then There Were None, which was a TV series with multiple episodes, or a mini series, and Persuasion, which was a single piece feature film. What are the main differences you as a composer will face? I mean, in terms of budget, or in terms of length of time you have to compose, or what are the structural differences a composer would face with those two different types of projects?
Yeah, I mean, doing Persuasion more recently was an absolute dream for me, because up until then I'd been doing more of the multi-episodic TV stuff, and which I love doing as well, completely love doing. But the one thing that was nice about doing a film was that once that's locked, and you can you can finish the music, and then it's and you record it, and it's done. Whereas often on TV you manage to, or like multi-episodic stuff, you get through the first episode and you feel like it's a triumph, but then you've got another five to do, and the terrifying thing about that is, if you're recording anything, which we did on And Then There Were None, just because you mentioned that one, we had an orchestra at Air doing it, a string ensemble at Air, and my sort of, the way that I try and do it is, if it's something where it needs a big sound, to try and get as many players playing at the same time in a really nice room is expensive. So trying to limit the amount of recording sessions you do, so you can kind of pack as much in as possible with the amount of players you can get, does mean that it's a little bit scary, because we only did one day of recording. I think we did 2 sessions in a day for that, and they hadn't locked episode 3 at that point. I don't think I'd seen half of episode 3 and it was a 3-parter. So I having to write material for stuff that you haven't seen, but also knowing that some things are locked, so you've got to get that down. But really believing in your themes quite a lot, and writing the material, knowing that you'll be able to reuse things, and with a clever bit of editing, maybe speeding up a bit, slowing things down, copying and pasting, you might kind of get through it.
Stuart, can I ask you quickly? So is the budget, is that something that comes under the composer? So do you have to work out how much money you have to compose the music for the score, and hiring the various people needed to do that for you?
Well, it does vary, but I'd say predominantly 95% of what I've done so far, and I think the higher up you go, it is different, but mostly how I've done it, and not necessarily through my choice, just that's sort of what's offered on the table, is that I'm given a lump sum of money that then I have to decide what I want to do with it. So it's out of that, it's my fee, but then also how much the recording budget's going to be, and to get the players or someone to mix the music, or or your assistants to do whatever. So it's kind of thinking it more as a head of department, and you're being given this bit of money, and then you decide how much you're going to spend on your wage, and then all the recording costs. And but what's slightly more complicated though as well is that, of course, as composers, we do get royalties at the back end. So one strategy, but this is also changing now because of video on demand and things like that, we're getting less back end money. But some people will take on projects that have a lower budget and will use all of their money on the recording costs and getting that score across the thing, and actually pay themselves a pittance or for a better word, but knowing that actually it will be a very successful documentary series that will be played in lots and lots of countries, and so they'll see that money, but a lot further down the road. And obviously that's one way of doing it, and I think you have to have quite a large portfolio of work to do that, obviously, and it's quite difficult to do. But that's not how the sort of projects I work on really work. So it's more, I give myself a bit of a fee, but then also try and work out how much I'm going to record. And so so you sort of have to be slightly clever about that. But if you're doing a project where they know it's going to be a big orchestral score, then they'll, hopefully they will have given you more money to do that. And if not, you can say, look, do you know what? We're just not going to be able to do that with the money. So either you give me more money, or we have to think of it a different way of doing it. So instead of having it as a 70-piece orchestra, why don't we talk about having a quartet? That kind of thing. So it's these things, and that was something I learned as well over time, is it's really easy to be really scared about asking or suggesting things because you just want to kind of please everyone and do the right thing. But actually saying, do you know what? I don't think we've got enough money to do this. We can sort of get close, but we can't quite do it. There's sort of various ways of doing it. And I think because ultimately, if they think they're going to get something and they're not, you don't want to ever disappoint anyone. So kind of having the nerve to actually not disrupt anything, but to actually have an honest conversation with people is key, because otherwise you can end up shooting yourself in the foot when people don't get what they think they're going to get. So, but yes, the budgets is a constantly differing subject from each film. So one TV show I did, it was all me in my studio playing all the instruments, doing all the synth stuff. But I got, and so actually, I did quite well out of that because I kept all the budget. But then, then if you're doing a big orchestral thing, you got to pay a lot of players to get that kind of sound. So that's a big difference as well in terms of the two. Going back to your original question as well about the idea of multi-episodic versus film, is that of course multi-episodic things, as I was saying, I try and do it all in one day if possible, just so that I can get as many players in as possible. But sometimes that just really isn't possible. So coming up again with strategies where, because you've got a certain amount of budget. One project we did lots of little, very small recordings over the time, which was great because it meant that we could develop the language as we went, because the tone of the show changed very drastically across the series. So I just knew that it was going to be pointless me spending all the money on episode 1 and sort of using it for themes later, because it just wasn't going to be that. So you sort of have to adapt to each show, really, or film.
So you said that on And Then There Were None, you had 2 days recording session, and it was a three episode mini series, but episode 3 hadn't locked and you hadn't seen parts of it. So you had that pressure to do all that music.
It was I think it was 1 day, but 2 sessions. So 2 or 3 sessions. So you're allowed to do, so 3, 1 session counts as a 3-hour recording session. Right. So you can do up to 3 recording sessions in a day, basically. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I mean, I might sound a bit silly here because you might say there's not one answer to this, but in a 3-hour recording session, how much music would you actually get recorded?
Yeah, right.
Is that just an open-ended, depends on the piece of music?
No, it's the musicians union here is incredibly strong. So there is a finite amount of music you can record within an hour, because it's to protect the musicians and the level of quality. Because what's so brilliant about London is that we do have some of the best session players in the world. So it's basically to stop you hitting play and record and just record 3 hours of music in the 3-hour session. So I think, and it also varies between different projects, but now I'm going to get this wrong, and all the fixers and musicians are going to be shouting at the screen as I say it. But I think it's something like, oh God, I feel nervous now. I think it's like about, you can only really lock off 8 minutes of music per hour of recording session. So I think that's the I think that's what it is. So I'm thinking about it now for And Then There Were None. I think I must have done 3 sessions. So that's 9 times 8, whatever that is. And so that's kind of the amount of music I could have recorded, I think. But then
just to ask another silly question, because I'm going to pretend because I don't know things. So when you say you can only lock off 8 minutes, you think an hour?
Yeah.
Does that mean you can only press record for 8 minutes, or you
no.
8 minutes?
Yeah, exactly. So you might have multiple takes. You're probably playing through most of it. Obviously you're talking between takes and discussing things, and sometimes changing stuff and things like that. But no, you can hit record the whole time, but it's just you can't. I don't actually know how they actually kind of keep a check on that. It's the music fix is always there, and the players, I think they would be like, actually it doesn't feel right, kind of thing. But and also I think going into the session they sort of ask, it's kind of but I know it sounds like not a lot, but if you're actually getting that amount done, that's good.
And obviously you can reuse that music.
Exactly, and exactly, and it depends on the deal. So again, it gets really complicated, all of this stuff. But it's and it's my music fixer does it for me, because it becomes incredibly complicated on what scale and all of that kind of thing. But you're always wanting actually to squeeze as much in as possible. It's kind of, you're never it's not because they can't play it, they can play it perfectly the first time. It's just kind of working out the shape of what you want and communicating to them. So it's kind of 8 minutes per hour, I think is it.
So let's just explain for the people at home. Can you just tell us what a music fixer is?
So when I want to, if I want to do something that isn't just me sitting in my studio, and I want to get players in, which is, because London, the musicians in London are so brilliant. What's great is you just go to a music fixer like Lucy Wally, who I've worked with for years, who works for Isabel Griffith Limited, who, if you look at their IMDb page, it's kind of it's sort of ridiculous. There's about 3 or 4 fixers, I would say, in London who kind of do everything. So it's kind of, and they have. I still not explain what a music fixer is. So I go to Lucy and say, I would like to record 20 string players. Can I have some of your best players, please, on this date? And she says, yes, you can. And what is it for? And I say, if it's like, and then now when I know, so it's a 3-part TV series. So we're going to be wanting to use the same bits of music in different episodes, and so she takes that on board. But they essentially have a roster of musicians on their list, and sometimes they'll be doing massive movies in different studios, so you're trying to jump around that, but the level of musicianship is so great, and having the fixers there is just, you just know that it's good there. The first time I did it with the proper fixer, it was amazing, because I was in the at Air Studios, and it was all the players who did all the film scores that I loved in the room that all the film scores were recorded in, and I was like, oh my god, this actually sounds like a bit of proper film music, because of course it's the same players in the same room, so it's kind of, so you suddenly get all of that brought into it as well. But I am in a privileged situation now that's kind of what I can do with getting a fixer on board. But because the musicians union are very strong, it's very fair in that you're still paying the players the same amount as other players. So it's very good. I mean, to start with, it was definitely calling in favors on everyone I knew, and me playing instruments badly, friends playing instruments well or badly. Sometimes I remember once doing a recording session for I needed some banjo playing, and it was a friend of mine who's an absolute extraordinary guitarist, absolutely amazing, and I turned up to do some recording in his house at the time, and because I said, how are you on the banjo? And he's like, oh, brilliant. And I was like, oh, great. Okay, that's great. Can you do something? It shouldn't be too hard. And he's like, yeah, fine. And I turned up, and I noticed on his computer, there was a YouTube video that said banjo for beginners. and I was like, oh, okay, hang on. But he was very good, so it's fine. But it's that to start with, I was definitely calling in as many favors as I could, and with promise of a bottle of wine and dinner sort of thing. But a music fixer now definitely makes these things easier. And so basically, answering your question, they are the people that I go to get the players, and they book the players, and they deal with the legal side of things as well. So, yeah.
Right. Okay, so another question I want to ask, and this relates to another NFTS backstory we had, where it was with Sam Mendes. And Sam Mendes talked about his working relationship with the composer Thomas Newman, where he said that it's always one of the most creative aspects of filmmaking, but also strangely one of the most difficult aspects of filmmaking for him, because there's always this clash between them. And it's normally about, where do you put the music? Where does the music end up in the piece? How do you make that decision? And how does it work with you and the director about where the music should go, how strong that music should be? Or is it better to just let the scene play without music and just allow it to just hold on the drama of the actors?
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely, I would say, probably almost the most important thing. Like, forgetting even about what the musical notes that you're doing, it comes back entirely to what I was talking about as well, with the idea of story, right? And so how coming up with that answer of where music goes is so important, because it is really easy to ruin a film by putting too much music in the wrong places, saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. And it's interesting because I can talk about the process in an ideal situation, but there's often never an ideal situation. But what you do, and this comes back to what I was saying, alluding to a little bit earlier about the idea of when the composer comes onto the project, and I was like, and it's you want to be on as early as you can be, because it means that you're having those discussions about where the music goes and what it's doing whilst they're editing. Whereas if you come in a little bit later, as the editing process is happening, the editor and director will put in what's called temp music, which is temporary music, and that's to help pace a scene, maybe to give it an atmosphere. And what's interesting is some composers, I think it's less and less, but composers used to get very upset with temp music, because sometimes things are just not achievable. So, I've done short films where they've put a piece of John Williams in or a bit of Hans Zimmer, and you've got like literally a zero budget, and you're like, we can't achieve that. But I think samples are so good now that you can get closer to it and things like that. But the thing with temp music is that it can be a really useful way of trying things out very quickly, but the danger is it gets stuck. And the reason why I was talking about where you come in a project as well, I think is so key, because it for me, it even seems to have changed a lot over the last couple of years, where now when things are being shot, I've got like I'll be given a secure link on a specific app that allows me to see the rushes coming in daily, or literally the day after, I think normally, that it's been shot, and like assembly cuts of scenes already going out to producers and people. And obviously that's terrifying for the director and the editor and everyone involved, because it's incredibly exposed suddenly. They're out of sequence, so they're not even necessarily scenes, just little chunks of certain things. So obviously people will start putting in temp music to dress it up, just to make it so they don't feel so exposed. And this seems to be happening more and more now because of the speed of how quickly people are seeing stuff. But nevertheless, even if you go back a few years where it was just the first assembly cut that people would be seeing, or the first director's cut, people will put temp music in just so that it gives it something, and so there's a certain tempo to the scene, or just a very loose emotion to it. So this is all really good in trying things out. But if you haven't got in there earlier with the director, if at all possible, to either be curating that temp music, or for you even to be writing your own material for that is the absolute dream, is that whilst they're shooting, you're generating material so that they're literally putting that in as they're cutting. That's really great. So and I haven't quite answered your question yet, but the moment you come into the process changes the idea of where you're putting music in. It is such a significant thing, because if you as a composer come in late in the project, the director and editor would have already chosen where the music's going to go. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just removes one layer of collaboration between the teams. But answering your question more specifically about how do you decide where it goes, so there's a thing called a spotting session, which literally just means you spot where the music is going to go, and that will often be with the director and the editor and the composer, sometimes the producer, and you go through the episode or the film in sections, and you just talk about each scene. And the way I like to do it is I want to know what the scene is about and what is going on, because even if the director is like, oh, actually, well, it's the scene where they have a fight and then they run around the corner and it's really exciting, I'm like, okay, what does that mean? What is the scene actually about? It's like, oh, well, going back to what we were saying, it's actually about betrayal, because this is the moment they find out about the betrayal. You're like suddenly like, okay, this is a story thing now. So the music here, if we're going to have music at all, it's actually about betrayal, because that's what we're trying to say. So so rather than fight music running around the corner, because what the amazing thing music can do when it's attached to images, it can tell you something that isn't on the screen. So if you've got someone shouting at each other because they're having this fight, and actually it's the betrayal thing that you've spent the whole time thinking, that is literally telling us that they're having that fight because it's about betrayal. So in that spotting session, I want to know about what the music is trying to do. What is the story that it's trying to tell? So if you firstly, and I literally write down, so often the director will say maybe a handful of words, which I will just scribble down on a piece of paper, like, oh, yeah, no, this is about betrayal, but actually it's got to be quite high energy because this is the climax of their relationship. And, so we've got to have that energy there, and it's got to have a real driving quality to it. So I'm writing down betrayal, high energy, driving, all these little words. So I've almost got a little cheat sheet about what these cues need to be musically, what they're doing. So my thinking is, as long as you're then answering this cheat sheet, then you're hopefully telling the same story that the director wants. And then sort of talking about how much music you put in, I'm always famously known for trying to take out as much music as possible, and having more of a, I suppose, a subtle touch. Because I think, going back to what I was saying, is like, if you've got what music can do, it can say something that isn't there. So if you've got someone shouting and you've got the music's also shouting, I don't know why the music needs to be there, because it's already on the screen. We don't need to be hit on the head twice. And I think that's often, it's kind of just a bit of a sort of a blunt, heavy-handed way of doing things. So ideally, you're trying to do something a bit more sophisticated than just saying what's already there. And so I think allowing performances of actors to breathe and give them that space is, I think, really key. And understanding that your music is not the most important thing on the screen, but that it's a contributing factor is so key. And so actually I've worked with directors who've really appreciated that I've just said, I don't want to do any music here, because I think, so it's not them thinking that I'm lazy. They get that I want there to be, a sensitivity and letting that space happen. I actually, there was one film that I was asked to do, and it was brilliant and ended up winning loads of awards. And I said, I don't think you should any music on it. And all my friends afterwards said, you complete idiot, you should have at least just written like 2 bars of music and crowbarred it. Yeah, exactly. But of course, maybe it won all those awards because there wasn't any music in it, because the performances were great, and it just sort of did it. I couldn't see how we could possibly work with music. So it's understanding. Again, it goes back to what I was saying right at the front about knowing you're catching up with the project. So everyone has really been working so hard to understand what this project is for maybe a year, 2 years, or whatever. And you're coming in very late. And so no wonder the directors are like, oh my God, who are these people coming in? Because like music, you can literally change the scene from it being a warm, scene about love and romance to some edgy kind of thriller, you know, so you can completely ruin someone's film very easily because of the power of it. So it's kind of understanding, trying to get inside the director's head really, and the earlier you come on to the process, the more you can make those mistakes. And what you want to try and do is create a safe creative space with you and the director and the editor and the producer, allowing you to make mistakes. So you'd be like, okay, well, maybe this scene doesn't need any music. And the director will be like, well, actually, do you know what? I always thought we would need something there. And you're like, I just think, can we not try it without music? And you're like, okay, are you sure? And then they might say, oh, well, actually, I don't think the performance is very good in that scene. And I was like, yeah, but it might not be exactly what you thought you were going to get, but I think it's really brilliant. So then you'd be like, okay, just trust me on this. Can we just do one pass at this and not score it? And if everyone says we really need music there, then of course I'll write something. And you know, because things are so different from the production stage to post-production, it often takes a bit of time for the director to get his or her head away from what they thought they were going to get to what they've actually got. So it's, oh my goodness, this is such a rambling answer to your where music should go, but I think it's so important about placement of music. It's why you're putting it there and what's it trying to do, and if you can crack that, that's it. I think that's the secret. And I don't know if I'm doing it, but yeah, anyway.
Well, we're almost coming to an end. So I wanted to just say thank you very much for giving us your time today to talk to us. And I hope people do check out some of Stuart's amazing work. You can visit his website and you can find many of his shows on streaming services. Stuart Earl, thank you very much for joining us today on NFTS Backstories.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.